Good day, everyone. This is John Gressett from COPA University Online. Welcome back. Today's topic is icing. This is a subject that we can all learn more about. So let's listen now as Ed Waters introduces Bill Frank during this live session recorded October 31st, 2020.
Thanks, John, and welcome everybody. Welcome to our perfectly timed icing class as we enter the fall season. Today's presenter is going to be Dr. Bill Frank. Bill Frank, as you know, is a Platinum CSIP, and he was also the recipient of COPA University's Lifetime Achievement Award back in March of this year. I fly a lot of low IFR. Some people call it hard IFR. I don't think it's really hard, though, because all you have to do is follow instructions. IFR can be challenging, though, for three different reasons. One is thunderstorms, the other one's low visibility, and the third is icing. Thunderstorms and low visibility are usually very apparent through the weather forecast, radar summaries, or the ATIS, where icing can be very cloak and dagger. And if you want to read about the dagger, please look at the October issue of COPA Pilot magazine. We had our safety issue on page 42. Max Trescott writes a great article about the icing accident that happened with one of his customers. Icing can vary across the country. Where I live in the Carolinas, my experience is mostly with rime ice. However, last month I was up near Green Bay and found myself in a whole different situation with some clear ice and some SLD. Icing always appears to be a mystery, and today I hope that Bill can unlock some of that mystery. So Bill, welcome, and thank you very much for all your participation this year. I think this is your third class, and we look forward to more. Thanks.
Welcome, everyone, to the final webinar of the year. Hopefully next year we won't have to do these and can invite you all to CPPPs, which are already being scheduled. As was alluded to a minute ago, we thought that icing would be an excellent topic to discuss going into the colder months of the year, no matter where you live, even though you can get icing, of course, year-round. This topic is going to be discussed in a slightly disjointed fashion, as what we're doing is taking excerpts from the full icing program that we do at the CPPPs. So I encourage you all to consider joining us at a CPPP to get the full presentation. We'll start out by discussing the components that it takes for icing to form. You literally have to have some form of visible moisture, whether that's clouds or precipitation. You have to have the existence of supercooled liquid, which is something I'll discuss in just a minute. The usual temperature range that we expect to see icing is from +2 degrees Celsius to -20 degrees Celsius, even though ice can occur at temperatures much colder. The reason we say +2 degrees centigrade is the airflow over the wing, of course, creates a low pressure because of the camber of the wing on top. And that low pressure causes a resultant cooling of the air. So you can have outside air that is +2 degrees as measured by your temperature probe, yet over the wing, it undergoes a decrease in pressure and therefore cooling. Most of the icing that you're going to encounter tends to occur close to the melting point of ice, which is 0 degrees Celsius, up to about -10. The colder it gets, the less likely you are to see ice. Back in grade school, we were all taught that water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius, and this simply wasn't correct. What 0 degrees Celsius really is the melting point of ice rather than the freezing point of water. So ice will always melt at 0 degrees Celsius. But water can exist in a liquid form well below 0 degrees Celsius, and this is the term supercooled liquid. Now, to visualize this, think of an ice cube, if you will, in an ice cube tray for those of us that can remember having to make ice in an ice cube tray and putting it in the refrigerator freezer. If you pulled out that ice cube tray a little early, and you looked at the ice cube, it would sort of be partially formed. It would have a liquid center that if you put a thermometer in it, would indicate a temperature well below 0 degrees Celsius. And that is supercooled liquid. The reason it froze to the perimeter was it found a freezing nucleus, a particulate matter for the supercooled liquid to glom onto and freeze, and then the surrounding liquid would then freeze onto that frozen particle, and so on and so forth, till you get an ice cube or a lump of hail or grapple or snow what becomes a freezing nuclei from most supercooled liquid in a cloud, unfortunately, is your airplane. So why do we worry so much about icing dangers? Certainly carburetor icing is not something we have to be concerned with. In a Cirrus, it affects only those with carbureted engines, not fuel-injected engines. Induction icing can be a potential problem in Cirrus, though are uncommon because of the location of the air filter and the shape of the air filter. Induction icing is generally not that common in Cirrus aircraft. Frost can be a problem, especially in composite aircraft. If you happen to leave your airplane out over a cold, clear evening and come back in the morning, you'll find a lot more ice on your wings than on the adjacent aluminum piper next to you. And then finally, structural ice. And this is ice that deposits on the aircraft while we're in the air. And this is the main focus of this talk, will be on structural icing. Why is ice bad? Well, for any number of reasons, it's bad. It's heavy. It weighs down the aircraft. As the aircraft gets weighed down, the angle of attack has to increase to compensate and maintain a level altitude. It changes the lifting characteristics of a wing, and this is critically important to understand. The wing that you bought with your airplane is no longer the wing that you have when you have icing contamination. And as a matter of fact, you can have a different wing on the right side than you have on the left due to the characteristics of the ice accumulating on each wing. It obviously increases drag. It can interfere with antennas to the point that you lose communication. It can cover your windshield. And if you've never experienced that, I've got a nice picture coming up of a Cirrus windshield coated over with clear ice. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And the other thing is, even though you may have a turbocharged engine or a turbo normalized engine that can perform to sea level performance levels up to 25,000 feet, your propeller has to remain clean. And hopefully that can be accomplished with both the TCAS system as well as the FIKI system. So where do we look for ice? Well, ice tends to be associated with frontal zones, east and northeast of low pressure centers, in the mountains because of orographic lifting of supercooled liquid in the valleys up into the higher regions of the atmosphere. In the Great Lakes region, because there's more water vapor available transpiring off the lakes, and in the Pacific Northwest because of a combination of high levels of water vapor in the atmosphere and actually warmer temperatures in the winter than you might see in the Midwest. So here's a typical example of a low pressure system. And if you look in the upper right-hand corner where it says cool air, that's the northeast quadrant of a low pressure system. And that's where icing is going to tend to be the worst. It doesn't mean that in the warm sector below it that you're not going to have icing, but in general, it's that northeast quadrant of a low pressure system that you have to be especially careful with. Let's talk for a minute about types of icing. We have rime mixed, clear ice, supercooled large droplet icing, and freezing rain and drizzle. And we'll talk about each of those and their threats individually here. In practice, the type of ice on your airframe really doesn't matter because all structural ice is bad. Rime ice is a milky, opaque appearing ice, although any ice that begins to develop on your wing almost always looks milky and opaque. So you will frequently hear pilots describing every kind of ice as rime ice. Rime ice, though, tends to occur only in colder temperatures from minus 10 degrees to minus 20 degrees. So when you're reporting ice, I would recommend you use your outside air temperature to judge what type of icing you have, at least in the early stages of icing formation. So if it's warmer than minus 10, call it clear ice and you're going to be right 90% of the time. In temperatures colder than minus 10, you're going to be in rime ice and you'll be right there about 90% of the time as well. Rime ice tends to conform to the surface that it adheres to. It's less disruptive than clear ice, as we'll talk about in just a minute, but nonetheless, all structural ice is bad. Mixed ice is sort of a combination of rime and clear ice, as you see on the leading edge of a cirrus in this picture. These are when conditions are not favorable for either, usually in temperature ranges from -8 to -12. Where this is going to affect you, however, is usually on a climb or descent. So you start out with warmer temperatures, and as you climb higher in that cloud layer, the icing transforms from clear ice in the warmer temperatures to rime ice in the colder temperatures. Clear ice tends to be transparent. It's rough. It's granular. It's gritty. You can see it in this picture on the unprotected edge of a cirrus wing, and it tends to eventually form horns or protrusions. The FIKI system in this case obviously worked very well, as the only areas of the aircraft that picked up this clear ice, or at least had it formed to this degree, were the unprotected areas. Now, I promised I'd show you a picture of how opaque a windshield can become. And here is an example of clear icing coating the windscreen of a Cirrus of a client of mine that I was flying with. And you can see that kind of coarse granularity to clear ice versus rime ice, which is more milky and opaque. If you look outside onto the wing, you also see that coarse granularity of clear ice before it forms those horns and projections. If you can look closely, you'll see some black streaking from the leading edge of the wing, and that's rollback. So it's a large enough droplet of ice to be considered supercooled liquid droplets as well, and we'll go on to that right now. This is supercooled large droplet icing. It's a subset of clear ice, but it's a larger droplet. So it doesn't freeze immediately on contact with the leading edge of the wing, and instead forms after the leading edge of the wing in a very granular formation that you can see in this picture. This is deadly for booted aircraft because it can form right behind the boots, and you lose all icing protection that you can have. In this case, we have TKS that tends to work much better for supercooled large droplet icing, but this tends to form very rapidly, even though it occurs in a fairly narrow band. And you need to be very careful with this type of icing. It tends to require an immediate response. Another picture of supercooled large droplet icing. This I took at night when I noticed some splattering on the windscreen, and immediately recognized, because I have personal experience with supercooled large droplet icing, that this indeed what was going on. I had my client turn on the ice light, and lo and behold, our wing was already rapidly being coated with supercooled large droplet type icing. Note the absence of much ice on the leading edge of the wing. Instead, it's all forming with rollback over the top of the wing. Freezing rain and freezing drizzle is a subset of clear ice. It's basically the same as supercooled large droplet icing. It just forms as a result of a different weather phenomena, but it can nonetheless coat your aircraft very rapidly. So we'll stop here for a few questions. So John, go ahead and fire away.
Okay, Bill, we have a question and a comment so far. So I'll start with a question. You were talking about a small band of icing of a few thousand feet. I wanted some clarification on, does this apply just to stratiform clouds, or is that a wrong assumption?
Actually, it applies more to stratiform clouds than the cumulus clouds, or clouds that have some vertical development. You can get icing anywhere. I use the term ephemeral when I'm talking about icing because it's just weird. You can be flying through a cloud for a half an hour and getting no ice, and then suddenly the conditions change. There's more supercooled liquid, and you start building ice very rapidly. But a change in altitude is probably the first thing that you ought to consider doing when you start getting into icing conditions. And often just changing 2,000 to 4,000 feet will get you out of that band of icing in both stratus and cumuliform type clouds. The cumuliform type clouds, you got to be very careful of not flying in the tops of those clouds, because that's where most of the moisture is, and you'll get the worst icing when you're flying along in the tops of clouds.
Okay, very good. And this next one is sort of a combo question comment. So maybe just your comment. Questioner was saying, I believe the laminar wing design is more conducive due to what Bill said about low pressure. Composites allow for better molding of the wing shape to make those laminar designs compared to the aluminum wings. That doesn't explain the frost comment.
Well, first of all, I would agree that laminar flow is more dangerous for icing for a couple of reasons. One, you have a thinner front leading edge to the wing with laminar flow wings or composite wings, and therefore you tend to pick up ice quicker. The thinner the leading edge, the more likely you are to get ice. I have no idea why composites tend to frost up quicker than aluminum aircraft. And in addition, you've all probably heard of sublimation, where it can go from a solid to a gas, basically the ice evaporating off your aircraft. It doesn't do that very quickly with composite airplanes. And instead, it takes, I would say, from experience, twice as long to sublimate off the wing than it does in a aluminum aircraft.
Very good, Bill. A couple came in through the general route, Bill, that we'll take them really quick.
Okay.
So Bill is asking, so in general, I guess you just descend to get out of icing conditions? Is that a better plan?
No, not necessarily. And in fact, we're going to spend a whole section of this webinar on options and tactical aspects of dealing with ice. So if we could hold that question for just a few minutes. Once we get done with the forecast section, we're going to spend some time on how to tactically deal with icing when you get into it.
Very good. And maybe this is another one, Bill, that you might want to hold on to for later. I'll let you decide is, what's your favorite weather product for uncovering different times of icing you might encounter for an upcoming flight, kind of like the pre-flight? You're going to be covering that later also?
Yeah, we're going to actually be covering it in the next section. So if we can hold on to that question for a minute, and if they still have that question, I haven't answered it satisfactorily, we can readdress it.
Excellent. Bill, why don't we move on just to keep us on schedule? Thanks.
Okay, so we are going to talk about forecasting ice now. There's several things that you need to look for when you're going to be flight planning a flight with potential icing as a consideration. You obviously want to know where the freezing level is. You want to know where the cloud bases are, but also you want to know where the cloud tops are, and that becomes critically important. We're going to talk about that here in just a minute. You want to see if there's any precipitation showing up along the route. You want to understand the terrain below you that you're going to be flying in, because that may very well limit your options. And you also want to take a look at the stability of the atmosphere. Are these clouds purely stratus, or is there some vertical development? I always start out with the G-AirMet plot, but I do not make this my go, no-go decision. It gives me a broad idea of where I'm going to find the ice, but it tends to incorporate a large part of the United States. If you're flying from Phoenix to Dallas, you would know you wouldn't have to worry about ice or shouldn't have to worry about ice. But if you were flying from Boise, Idaho to Portland, Oregon, then you are going to have to deal with some icing en route. So this is kind of a good starter just to see if you need to delve further. We want to know where the cloud bases are. That's pretty easy. We can look at METARs along the route, but we also want to know where the cloud tops are. And where do you find the cloud tops? My two favorites for the person that asked that previous question are soundings, or the SKU log P diagram, and the graphical forecast for aviation, the GFA tool. Obviously, PIREPs can be helpful if they're current and along your route, or at least close to your route. And satellite pictures are very helpful, but we're not going to have time to get into that with this webinar. You're going to have to attend the CPPP class to get the rest of that. If we look at the SKU log P diagram, it's very confusing when you first look at it. And that leads me to put another plug in for Jerry Seckler's soundings course, so that you really gain a basic understanding of soundings. But if you look at the bottom of the graph, you see numbers starting from the left at -40, going horizontally to the right to +40. Those are lines of temperature, and they're skewed from left to right, hence the name QT. The red line is the ambient temperature line. The blue line is the dew point line. Where that ambient temperature crosses the 0 degree temperature line is the freezing level. In this case, it's down around 3,000 feet. The other thing you can determine from soundings is the existence of clouds. In this case, there are no clouds. The red and blue lines remain separated all the way up through the atmosphere. So that despite the fact that you'd be flying in air that is below 0 degrees Celsius, you're not going to encounter any clouds. However, in this picture, you can see that the blue and red lines come fairly close together. And when that happens, there's going to be clouds. And in this case, there's clouds from nearly the surface all the way up through about 10,000 feet. And then at 10,000 feet, the red and blue lines separate fairly dramatically. So you should have a nice layer to fly in above 10,000 feet. And notice that the ambient temperature line, the red line, does not cross the 0 degree temperature line until you get to about 8,000. So you're really only going to have to go through clouds that are below freezing or below 0 degrees Celsius for about 2,000 feet. This really only works with stratus clouds. It does not work with cumulus clouds, especially in the summer months. And there are other things you can use the SKUT log P for in the summer. And again, put in a plug for Jerry's class on soundings. The GFA tool is found under Tools, not the red news, but under Tools. Click on the GFA tool and you get something that looks like this if you select Forecast for Clouds. You get these quadrants that give you anticipated bases and tops of the clouds. So this is really good, I think, to use when planning a flight without having to look at the individual soundings themselves. It doesn't give you the freezing levels and that sort of thing, although you can certainly add that on to this graphical tool. Another one that I really like is the Aviation Weather Center at aviationweather.gov. Click on Forecast and then select Icing. And the product that you want to look at is the lower left panel that says Forecast Icing. You can select different altitudes and you can select probability or severity and even combine the two to both probability and severity. But here's an example of ice at 5,000 feet in the left panel, and in the right panel, ice at 11,000 feet. And if you were going to go through Illinois that day, it would look much better going at a lower altitude than at the higher altitude of 11,000 feet. Where I think it's even more pertinent is you can carry this out 18 hours. And here is the icing probability in the left panel at 5,000 feet on Saturday. But if you simply wait a day to Sunday, most of that icing threat disappears in the Midwest there. So that's always a consideration. Look out ahead and see if it's going to be significantly better the next day. All right, we'll pause again for questions.
Yeah, and Bill, right now we're not getting very many questions. So why don't you go ahead and just keep plowing forward?
Okay, we'll go ahead and move forward to icing tactics here. There are two systems that the Cirrus comes equipped with if you choose the icing option. One is the TKS or non-hazard system. This doesn't make it legal to fly into ice. It's got two modes, a normal and maximum mode. And if I'm flying in an aircraft with regular TKS, the non-hazard system, I would tend to turn on the TKS before I enter clouds or precipitation where icing may be likely. And I use it as icing or anti-icing rather than de-icing. The normal mode is used for anti-icing and the maximum mode used only if ice continues to accumulate on the leading edge of the wing and the normal mode is not enough to handle it. In that case, you really need to get out of icing as rapidly as possible. If you're just transiting a layer of clouds and expecting to be on top in the relatively near future, then you can use this as an anti-icing system. Just make sure you have a plan B or even a plan C. The FIKI system or Flight and Known Icing System is a certified system for light to moderate icing. It's not certified at all for severe icing, but it's significantly more robust than the non-hazard system. It's got several pumps. It's got a a number of options for the TKS fluid, and it has more fuller coverage of the wings, the vertical stabilizer, and the windscreen. In addition, it gives you some ice lights to look at night, like I showed you a minute ago with the pictures of supercooled large droplet icing. It gives you an angle of attack sensor, which becomes critical in determining when you're approaching stall, because remember, you do not have the same wing that you did when you took off once you're contaminated with ice. Cirrus requires that you do an icing class, and this is mandatory for you to fly an icing with the FIKI system, and it has to be redone every 2 years. It's free. It's a great course. They change it up a little bit every year, and it's well worth repeating at least every 2 years. Having FIKI, however, is not a pass to tempt fate. When you start accumulating ice, even with a FIKI system, you need to start thinking about what your options are, and we're going to discuss those shortly. You can climb, you can descend, you can continue. Sounds counterintuitive, but we'll talk about each of these individually. You can divert, you can return, you can declare an emergency, or you can utilize caps. We'll talk about escaping supercooled large droplet icing. If you do see a considerable amount of rollback or buildup of icing after the leading edge of your wing, you need to start taking action now. You can climb or descend 2,000 or 3,000 feet, turn around with careful pitch and roll inputs, because you don't know how contaminated your wing is, or what your stalling speed, well, I should say what your new critical angle of attack will be. So you want to make a 180-degree turn and exit those icing conditions, and try not to encounter any further ice accumulation of any kind. You have to worry a little bit about tailplane icing with significant wing contamination. We don't have the time to get into that for this webinar, but I'd refer you to a NASA video called NASA tailplane icing. If you simply Google NASA tailplane icing, you'll get this video. It's excellent. It's very instructive. It lasts only about 20 minutes, and it may be 20 minutes that may save your life. If you climb or descend, anytime you make a turn, I would combine the turn with a climb or descent of 2,000 to 4,000 feet. If you're going to go up, and that's usually the choice that I use when I'm flying a turbocharged or turbo-normalized aircraft, you should know where the tops are. That, as we discussed, can be determined to a degree with pre-flight planning. But reality is reality, and the best way to know where the tops are when you're en route is to simply ask. Just talk to air traffic control and tell them and ask them where the tops are, and they'll find aircraft nearby that can give you a tops report. Even if you can't get a tops report, you can frequently get an idea of where the icing isn't. You may be at 11,000 feet. There may be an aircraft at 14,000 feet, and you're both in clouds. Neither of you are on top. But the aircraft at 14,000 feet is not experiencing any icing. So that would make the choice of climbing a good one. It's not the answer for freezing rain. We were always taught, especially those of you who are old as I am and learned instrument flying back in the 70s, that you always want to climb if you encounter freezing rain. The problem with that is you can go right through that narrow band of warmer air and right back into the cold air if you're not careful as you climb through and watching your outside air temperature. And also, as I alluded to before, beware that the worst icing is near the tops. If you're going to descend, the critical thing here is you need to have adequate terrain clearance. Not really a problem in the Midwest for the most part. That would probably be the decision that I would make if I lived in the Midwest or were flying in the Midwest in icing conditions, is I would descend. Here you're looking for above freezing temperatures, warmer temperatures. You do have to consider airspace considerations, but descent is frequently the best option in the Midwest. Not really an option where I live in the Pacific Northwest, because we have significant terrain everywhere, and certainly less of a desirable option in the Rocky Mountain region. You can continue. You can exit the icing threat by continuing on, but only if you know the conditions ahead of you. That can usually be easily determined with your data link weather systems, looking at METARs and so forth ahead of you. It's not the answer for freezing rain or supercooled large droplet icing, because that tends to accumulate very rapidly, and you really need to make a more rapid exit of the icing conditions when you start to experience that. You can divert. In this case, though, it's not like asking for 10 or 20 degree deviations around cumulus buildups like you do in the summer. In this case, you're trying to stay clear of the clouds and precipitation, and that usually involves a reroute with air traffic control. So pick a VOR or an intersection off route and then request a reroute for air traffic control. If you use the word weather in that request, you'll almost always get it granted. It's Salt Lake City Center, requesting a reroute for weather. And if you throw that word weather in, you're more likely to get that approved. Again, combine any changes in direction with an altitude change. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten out of icing when I started to turn just by climbing or descending. So that's definitely a consideration. You can turn around, especially if the weather is worse than was forecast and you can see that it's getting worse and worse. You want to do this obviously early in the icing encounter if you have a contaminated wing. If you don't have a TKS system or it's being overwhelmed, then you want to turn slowly. You want to limit your bank to 10 to 15 degrees. A bank, even if it takes you a little bit longer to get twisted around. You can declare an emergency, and that's something that I strongly believe in and wish people would do more frequently. I've declared a number of emergencies and have yet to fill out any paperwork as a result of that declaration. But at the very least, you want to clearly communicate with air traffic control. You want to be assertive. You need to tell them what you need or what you want. And it's not like I don't take no for an answer, but you have to be very assertive with them. Change altitude. That often will work to get you out of the worst of the icing conditions. So simply change or request a change in altitude. If you change altitude and you level off, and once your energy from the descent has dissipated, you want to make sure you're not continuing to lose airspeed. If that is the case, you must, and I mean that sincerely, you must continue descending. Accept a controlled descent. Do not level off and allow your airspeed to decrease. Your wing is going to be at an increasing angle of attack, attempting to maintain altitude, and you no longer know what your critical angle of attack is going to be. And your only indication of a stall will likely be stall buffet, which doesn't give you very much time to react. If the situation is dire, obviously, without hesitation, pull caps. If you have ice accumulation, once you've made your decisions and you've started to embark on plan B or plan C, avoid using the autopilot. Again, your only indication of stall may be stall buffet, and you won't feel that if you have the autopilot on. And this is a good reason to maintain proficiency with hand flying the airplane, especially in IMC conditions. Monitor your airspeed. Those of you that have DFC 90, you can put an airspeed bug on your current airspeed and then check it periodically. And if it continues to decrease, you need to go down. Minimize your bank angles. Again, accept a controlled descent. And again, obviously consider caps. If you're going to fly an approach with contamination on your wings, because the airplane is flying, you're able to maintain a sufficient airspeed at altitude. You may want to go ahead and fly an approach at an airport. When you do this, you want to intercept the localizer as far out as possible, and you need to communicate that to air traffic control. The reason being is that the further out you intercept it, the more shallow the intercept angle can be, allowing you more time to get established on the localizer without making significant banked turns. Keep your speed up. When I researched this talk 10 or so years ago. The research papers all suggested about 20% above your normal speed for final approach. IFR magazine suggested 30%. If your final approach speed in this case is going to be 85 to 90 knots because you're not going to use more than 50% flaps, then you're going to be looking at 110 or so knots all the way down over the threshold maintained until the aircraft contacts the ground. Therefore, you want to try for the longest runway. Avoid any changes in configuration. Cirrus suggests only 50% flaps. If your wing is really contaminated, you don't have a TKS optioned aircraft, then you may want to land no flaps, which is an even greater airspeed. Don't flare excessively. Let the airplane sort of pancake onto the runway. If you flare too aggressively, you may induce a tail stall and the nose is going to drop and it's going to mess up your day. If you slide off the end of the runway because you're flying a no flap approach to landing, you're more likely to survive that and be home for dinner than you are if you tailplane stall and plant the nose in the ground 200 yards from the approach end of the runway. So keep that in mind, keep your speed up. So we'll pause again for some final questions. Looks like we've got plenty of time, so don't hesitate to ask away.
Yep, Bill, not only do we have plenty of time, we got plenty of questions,
Okay.
my friend. So let me bring this first one up to you. This is kind of an open-ended question, so you can answer it that way. Bill, what criteria do you use when deciding whether to begin a flight when there's a reasonable chance of icing along that route?
Obviously, that's a difficult and lengthy question to answer. At least the answer to the question is difficult and lengthy. I think I rely a lot on the SCUT log P diagrams. And if I can either get on top through a layer of clouds that is relatively thin, by that I mean 4,000 feet or less, to climb through under freezing conditions, then I think with a TKS equipped aircraft, it's a reasonable option to consider. If you don't have a FIKI system, then we get into questions of whether it's legal or not legal. I think if you have a pilot report that indicates moderate icing within 15 minutes or 20 minutes of your departure time, the FAA is probably going to look on that as known ice. Now, they're only going to come after you if you crash the airplane. However, it's not really a legal operation. The definition, however, of known ice is ice that is on your wing. Until it appears on your wings, the ice is not known. And as I alluded to earlier, man, icing is really ephemeral. It's amazing how it can be in one area of the cloud and not in another area of the cloud. Another thing to recall is snow is your friend. If it's snowing, it means that the ice or the water vapor in that cloud has glaciated. In other words, it's found that freezing nucleus and it's glommed on to other particles of ice until it got large enough to fall as a snowflake. So generally, when flying through snow, you generally would not expect to get ice. However, if you continue to climb through the upper ranges of that cloud, you may lose snow and start getting into supercooled large droplet icing. So always take care with that. I think also the length of the trip makes a difference. If the exposure to clouds below freezing is limited and minimal, then I think it's reasonably safe to fly. If, however, that exposure is going to be extensive, you got to climb 8,000 feet to get on top, or you're going to be in and out of the clouds the entire way, then I think that would be a no-go decision for me. And Jerry goes over this quite nicely in his SCUT log P or soundings program, as well as we give that more discussion in our forecast section of the icing presentation.
Yeah, I agree, Bill. And that's also certainly well covered in just your classic ADM classes on aeronautical decision making. So another question that came in, and again, it's probably no right or wrong answer to this, but if you report ice to ATC, are you going to get in trouble for that?
No, actually, I've been flying for almost 50 years, and I know of no one who's ever been busted by the FAA for reporting ice. In fact, since 2000, I think there's only been one prosecution, if you will, for icing or flight in non-icing conditions, even though there, I'm sure, are hundreds to thousands of aircraft flying in ice, if you will, illegally. I think the idea here is that if you have a basic TCAS system or no TCAS system and you get in icing, you need to make a decision to get out of icing. A FIKI will allow you to continue in icing conditions, though that's not always safe. But a non-hazard system with just TCAS or a clean wing, you just got to start making decisions to get out icing. If you do that, even if you crash, because of the ice, the FAA is not going to come after you. One other thing that I should have alluded to in the previous question, if I could just touch on this quickly for a minute, is in the Midwest, temperatures on the ground are almost minus 15, minus 20 degrees Celsius. And if I have an area of clouds that I've got to climb through under those conditions, unless there's a temperature inversion, I think it's very unlikely that I'm going to find ice under those conditions. The closer you get to minus 20, the less likely you are to have ice. So go ahead.
Yeah, very good, Bill. I think that really clarifies. One other question that came in, Bill, and I guess I don't know the exact answer to this, but a couple people have asked the question that, hey, when did the Cirrus Icing Awareness course become free? You know, it says on the website that it's $150 for a permanent enrollment. So what's happening there? And I think what's going on, Bill, from my understanding, is that if you get a FIKI plane, I think you can get them to turn it on for you for free if you talked with your salesman or whatever. But even for $150, I think it's, money well spent either way. Did you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I sure do. I guess I overspoke myself. The course is free to repeat. The first time you take it, you have to pay for it. Even the guys with the FIKI systems have to pay for the course the first time around. Of course, if you're paying $1 million for a brand new Cirrus, you can probably certainly talk them out of that $150, and they can get a code to avoid that charge. But it's every time you retake it, that is now free.
Yes, it is a permanent enrollment, indeed. A question about the AOA indicator, Bill. Is that thing accurate when the wing is iced up?
To a degree, yes.
Okay. How will you know if the tail of the plane is icing? Any indicators for that?
Yeah, you can assume that whatever ice on your wings is worse on the tail, because again, the tail is a thinner airfoil, and thinner airfoils collect ice more rapidly than thicker airfoils. That's why a Bonanza doesn't ice up as quickly as a Cirrus does or a Columbia does, because it's got a bulky leading edge to it. So if you have ice contamination on your wing, you can assume that the ice contamination on the horizontal stabilizer is going to be worse. And I would be very cautious of even going to 50% flaps for an approach and landing under those circumstances.
Right. This might be a question better posed to Roger Whittier, our A&P airframe person, but do you know if TKS fluid expires, Bill?
Yes. Well, I should say no, but I've had TKS sitting in a barrel for 2 years, and it just turned into a bunch of goo. So I know a lot of guys store TKS, and in general, it depends on the climate conditions. It stays in pretty good shape for at least a year for the season. Otherwise, I do as you and I do, John. We buy it in 5-gallon increments and hope that lasts us the season.
There you go. Yeah, I think that's a good thing. I think probably buying a 55-gallon barrel is maybe not a good plan unless you go through a lot of TKS. So one other question that came from the group was, I use my FIKI system, and the fluid just keeps dripping out of my wings and makes a real mess of my hanger and gets on my shirt, and it never goes away. Is there any way to avoid, trying to get the fluid out of the wings before you park it?
Yeah, turn it off about a half an hour before you land. And obviously that doesn't work if you're in icing conditions on an approach. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of this type of anti-ice de-ice system. If you have to fly an approach with it running, you're going to get your hangar messy, and it does take a while for it to flow off the wing. I would say you could wash it off with a pressure hose, but then of course you're going to turn your airplane into an ice cube. So that really doesn't work either. I would, before John, you and I had an airplane together with my other airplane, I would leave it outside and just let it kind of dribble off in front of the hangar and then come back the next day and push it back in the hangar.
Right. That actually is probably one of the best things. And one other thing I guess I noticed as I'm looking through all the questions that are coming in, somebody did the URL available for that NASA tailplane icing video. I think that one's highly recommended. The other thing I guess people that want to know more about is this Jerry Seckler guy. Bill, do you want to maybe perhaps introduce him a little bit more? He's well known to many, but you kept referring to him. You might want to talk about Jerry just for a moment.
So the CPPP events are arranged around this concept of a university system. And we have deans of different colleges within that university system. And one of those colleges is the College of Flight Operation. And that was headed up by Jerry until this year when he retired from that position. God bless him. And he's been the dean and also a creator of many of the courses that we present at the CPPP. And he's obviously a co-contributor for this course on icing. We actually merged the icing tactics course with the icing forecast course. I think it was a year or so ago. Obviously, this year nothing happened, so it must have been the year before. And Jerry has been very instrumental in many of the courses that are presented at the CPPPs.
Very good. And a couple people have been doing more research. It looks like TKS has a 2-year shelf life. Somebody looked that up for us. Thank you for that. And I'm just kind of running through all
I know of guys that have kept it in their hangar for over a year. I have a client of mine in Aurora that keeps stores larger volumes. He flies frequently, so he goes through it. I just found that after a couple of years, it started to gel, and it wasn't something that I was going to put in my airplane.
No kidding. Maybe a little bit more, Bill, on what tools you find your favorites. You obviously went through a couple here formally on your pages, but are there other tools? Somebody mentioned the Weather Spork perhaps, or some other ones that are available. What's your read on that? Just your subjective feeling, if you would, please.
Yeah, I think Weather Spork is very good. It's a little pricey, but still an excellent one that's put together by Scott Denstadt, a retired meteorologist and a guy who gives webinars on different weather products. The other one I like is Windy. I think that is very similar to Weather Spork and has the majority of the same information presented a little differently, maybe not as cleanly as Scott's program. And both of those, I think, are valuable. But, really, I rely on the SKUT log P diagrams. And if you download SKUT log Pro, that app will allow you to put in your departure and destination airports and your time of departure, your time of arrival. And it allows you to get multiple SKUTs by sliding along your route. And that, to me, gives me a lot of information, but you have to learn how to understand SKUT log Ps. It's really not that hard. And again, a plug for Jerry's course on soundings. The other one I like to use is the lower left panel under Forecast Icing from aviationweather.gov. We showed a picture of both probability and severity, and that has a tool that you can use where you can go up and down in the atmosphere to see the icing probability become more severe or less severe. And that really is helpful in selecting an altitude.
Very good. One other question here. Could you recap for us, Bill, which temperatures is the most risky for ice?
Yeah, I think, well, you can get icing at any temperature down to minus 40 degrees Celsius, but the most icing is going to occur between -1 and -20. And within that framework, the worst icing is between -1 and -10, because that's clear ice. It's a larger droplet. I showed pictures of how granular and uneven it is, or how coarse it is, compared to rime ice, which is, although it has some spikes to it, it tends to conform to whatever it's adhering to, and it tends to be less disruptive to the airflow than clear icing. So I can consider all icing dangerous, but clear icing the most dangerous.
Very good, Bill. You know what? I think we're going to have to cut it off. We're about 90 seconds from the end of the hour, and I do like to stop these things right on time. I want to thank you, Bill, for your presentation. We got some great questions coming in. This is going to be our last event for the season. We'd like to look forward to seeing you on a face-to-face weekend session here in 2021. We're doing our best to hold them, and we'll try to make them happen. Bill, any parting words that you'd like to share with the group?
Well, as the screen indicates, you can support all of this that they do, these webinars and all of the work that goes into COPA University by following that link, tiny URL link to COPA U donation. And I'd like to hit you up for even a few bucks if you can. These events are free. We don't get paid for them. If you can contribute anything to help support our resources, it's very important.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank also everybody for attending today. It's much appreciated. Take care, everyone.